Welcome to the Gold and Blue Tube week number 5 playoff poll. I'm a little depressed because the college football season is officially over. We do have the championships coming up and then the playoffs and the bowls and all that stuff, but the season, believe it or not, is gone. So this will be our next to the last poll. We'll have another poll after the championships, and a lot of chaos could happen between now and then. But for now, week number 5, it is the beginning of the end. For the chaos meter, we set it at extreme. One of the main reasons we did that is because of one game, and it was the Alabama-Auburn game. Not just because of the outcome, but because of the entire game itself. We had punt returns, we had a 100-yard interception return, and we had a penalty on Alabama for 12 men on a punt that essentially ended the game for them. So that game in and of itself defined chaos. So you couple that with all the other things that happened, we bumped it up to extreme, well into extreme, not barely into extreme this week, well into extreme. So as per usual, before we get into the actual top 10, we got to tell you who we knocked out. For this week, we have Minnesota. They've been in and out several times. They have that good win against Penn State, but that's it. And then you have 2 losses at Iowa versus Wisconsin. Not really terrible losses. There's just not enough quality wins to dismiss those 2 losses. The other team has actually consistently been in our top 10, and that's Alabama. They finally got knocked out. They lost that crazy game to Auburn, That was a crazy game. They have a decent win against A&M, but just like Minnesota, they have 2 losses. Neither one terrible losses. They have the loss versus LSU and at Auburn, which actually both of those losses for Alabama were crazy. But just not enough quality wins to dismiss those 2 losses. Alabama gets kicked out. Their previous ranking in our poll was number 6. So, making their debut in our Gold and Blue Tube Top 10 is Notre Dame. Last week and pretty much every week before then, they were non-ranked in our polls. They have a decent win against Virginia, who won the ACC Coastal. A decent win against USC. A decent win against Virginia Tech, who lost to Virginia for the ACC Coastal. And a decent win against Navy. Now, Notre Dame has 2 losses. They have the loss at Georgia and the loss at Michigan. So their losses are not that bad either. Plus, they have enough meat on the bone to crack the top 10. So, for the first time in the Gold and Blue Tube Top 10 poll, we introduced number 10, Notre Dame. Also making their debut in our top 10 poll is Wisconsin. They have some pretty good wins. They have a win at home versus Michigan, a win at home versus Iowa, and a win at Minnesota, which was this past week. They have 2 losses. They lost at Illinois, which at the time looked terrible. Turns out, Illinois is going to make a bowl. Also, that loss to Ohio State, which wasn't competitive, but Ohio State is a very good team. So, good wins, 2 losses. Wisconsin also makes their debut at number 9, just ahead of Notre Dame. Moving on to number 8, Penn State, pretty consistent in our top 10. They've had some losses that hurt them. They do have the win at Iowa versus Michigan and versus Indiana, all those decent teams. Then you have the loss at Minnesota and at Ohio State. So their losses, once again, not terrible. And they have 3 decent wins to keep them in our top 10. And this week, Penn State's at number 8. We're moving on to number 7, Baylor. Yep, Baylor jumps back in at number 7. Last week, they were at number 9. The Big 12 presented Baylor with some decent wins that I didn't realize was going to happen at the beginning of the year. Iowa State, Kansas State, and Oklahoma State, all pretty decent wins. And then, of course, the loss to Oklahoma, which if they would have kept playing, they were playing the way they were playing in the first half of that game, they wouldn't have lost that game. But they pulled an egg in the second half, and they ended up losing. So their only loss is to a good Oklahoma team. So that keeps Baylor firmly in our top 10 at number 7. And here we go at number 6, which if you've been watching my videos, you've been waiting on this one. Georgia. Yep, Georgia, they get bumped up a spot. They have wins against Notre Dame, which I consider a good win. They're in our top 10 now. They got a win against Florida. They have a win against Auburn. They have a win against A&M. All decent wins, but then you have that bad loss against South Carolina. I can't get that out of my head. And then you also have that comparison with Clemson, who is definitely a playoff team, and Clemson whooped South Carolina. Also, you have the Texas A&M comparison, not just with Clemson, but with LSU. They both played A&M as well. Georgia struggled, and both LSU and Clemson spanked Texas A&M. And that's why I don't have Georgia in my top 4 right now. Not just because of the loss, but because they don't look good even in their wins. Yes, they have some good wins, but they just do not look good doing it. And I know you're probably sick of me, ragging about Georgia week in and week out, but that's just my take. And I've had to eat crow over Georgia before because they did beat Auburn, and I didn't think they were going to do it. Still don't think they're going to make the playoffs. We'll see how they do against LSU. Plus, I still have that bet where if Georgia goes on to win the national championship, wins it, not just gets there, then I will change the name of this show to Black and Red Tube and wear Georgia attire for an entire week. So, like I said before, if you really want to get back at me, Georgia, win the national championship, and I'll wear your colors for an entire week. Do I think that's going to happen? No. That's why I'm making the bet. I am 100% confident that it's not going to happen. You're going to have to prove me wrong, Georgia. Sorry, not sorry. Georgia comes in at number 6. Number 5, we have Utah. Last week, Utah was number 4. They actually fall a spot, and that's not just, it's not because of how they did, because they did win and had a pretty good game against a bad Colorado, which Colorado isn't as bad as I thought they were, but still not good. They have wins against Arizona State, who beat Oregon, and also a win at Washington. They do have that loss at USC. USC kind of creeped back in, got into the top 25 again. So that's not a terrible loss for Utah. They're 11-1, and they fall a spot this week in our rankings. They are coming in at number 5. And the reason they fell to number 5 is because of our next team, and that's Oklahoma. I bumped Oklahoma all the way up to number 4 because that Oklahoma State win, I think, is a good win, and it's better than the win that Utah had, and they were pretty close anyways. So that was enough for me to put Oklahoma in the 4th spot. Last week they were at number 8. They have good wins versus Iowa State, at Baylor, at Oklahoma State, and then the loss at Kansas State. Not a terrible loss. Kansas State just beat Iowa State. They'll probably get back into the top 25 and head into a decent bowl. So Oklahoma looking pretty good. And they head into the showdown with Baylor. And that game right there will have a direct impact into the college football playoffs. The college football playoffs. I think the winner of that game has a very, very legitimate shot of making the playoffs. Oregon losing did not help Utah. They could still get in with 1 loss, but playing Oregon with 2 losses, that didn't help them at all. It would have been better if both teams would have had 1 loss. Oh well, you can't control what Oregon does. So the winner of Oklahoma and Baylor is going to have a big-time say as to that 4th spot in the college football playoffs. So the number 3 spot this week stays the same. LSU 12-0, undefeated, wins against Florida, Auburn, Alabama, and A&M. I bumped the Alabama win from a great win to a decent win because Alabama's not as good as I thought they were. Especially with the loss to Tua. Alabama only has that one decent win against Texas A&M. So that's not a great win like I thought it was. Still a good win, and LSU is still undefeated, and they will go on to play Georgia in the SEC Championship. The winner of that game will 100% be in the college football playoffs. So that will be the game to watch. So the number 2 team in our poll this week stays the same. Clemson, 12-0. They go to South Carolina, pound the snot out of them. They have decent wins against A&M and Wake Forest. Direct comparisons to Georgia makes Georgia look silly. They whooped South Carolina. South Carolina beat Georgia. They whooped A&M, and Georgia struggled against A&M. I'm sorry, but the comparison between Clemson and Georgia, not very good. Same with LSU. They embarrassed A&M. Georgia struggled with A&M. So that's the comparison I make with playoff teams to Georgia, who some people think is a playoff team. If you compare them with LSU and Clemson, they're really not a playoff team. But they do have a chance. If they beat LSU, they will be in spite of my concerns for Georgia. So Clemson coming in at number 2. Staying at number 1, not even close, Ohio State. They stay undefeated at 12-0. Last week they were number 1. They have good wins against Cincinnati, Indiana, Wisconsin, Penn State, Michigan. Their resume is stacked. Number 1 at points per game. Number 1 at points against. This team looks good. However, I will say, the team that I just mentioned, Clemson, they're looking really good as well. If you watch that South Carolina team, they look like a national championship team as well. So, for me, Ohio State is by far the number 1 team right now, but Clemson, I think, is closing the gap. I'm still concerned with LSU's defense, and that number 4 spot's still up for grabs. Right now, I have Oklahoma, but we all have Oklahoma, Utah, and Georgia still fighting for that spot. Those are the main contenders right now. You still have a sneaky Baylor who still might have a say in it, but for right now, I think it's between Oklahoma, Utah, and Georgia. All Georgia has to do is beat LSU. You know, this sets up for a crazy ending, though, because if some of these undefeateds going into championship week lose, there's going to be a lot of head scratching. What if Ohio State loses to Wisconsin, a 2-loss Wisconsin? What if Clemson loses to Virginia? You know, what if Utah loses to Oregon? What if total chaos happens? That's what I'm hoping for. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if everything plays according to what the script says it should play, or if chaos rules the day. So that's all I have for you this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to have one more poll come out after championship week. We'll see how the chaos meter looks after that. Until then, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me. And we'll see you next video.